Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're heading up north to Alaska. You guys sent in a ton of research on ANCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Seems like you really want to get a handle on what this act did, good and bad, especially the part where Alaska Natives had to give up their claims to land.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible story, complicated for sure. ANCSA was a landmark piece of legislation, passed back in 1971, meant to tackle a problem that had been brewing for a long, long time.
So paint the picture for us. Alaska before 1971. Alaska Natives, they'd been there for centuries upon centuries, but the U.S. government never really recognized their land rights.
Exactly. Totally different from what happened in the lower 48. There just weren't treaties with Alaska Natives, so there was this constant question mark hanging over who actually owned the land.
No treaties, no reservations. Sounds like a recipe for conflict, especially with all the development happening in the state and the whispers about oil.
Oh, it absolutely was. And all that tension, it really boiled over when they discovered oil in Prudhoe Bay in '68. Everything changed, basically overnight.
So was ANCSA a direct response to that oil discovery?
You could say that, yeah. It definitely threw gasoline on the fire, so to speak. The Secretary of the Interior then, Stuart Udall, he actually put a freeze on any federal land being transferred to the state. This was back in '67. He knew they had to figure out this native land claim situation before things spiraled even more.
It sounds like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. So ANCSA, that was their solution.
Well, it was the solution they came up with. It said, okay, Aboriginal land titles, they're gone, meaning Alaska Natives couldn't make claims to their traditional lands anymore.
Hmm.
And in exchange, they got 44 million acres of land and almost $1 billion. But here's the thing. That money and land, it went to these brand new Alaska Native corporations, not directly to the tribes or individuals.
Operations, huh?
Mm.
That's a little different.
It was, and that's where a lot of the criticism comes in. Critics said this whole corporate structure, it just didn't fit with how Alaska Natives traditionally saw land and resources. Their systems of government, they were all about collective decision-making and this deep spiritual connection to the land.
So instead of working within the tribes, they kind of imposed this outside system.
Yeah, and some people saw this as a way to force Alaska Natives into this capitalist way of thinking, essentially making them abandon their traditional ways.
So in a way, ANCSA, it solved one problem, the land claims, but it created a whole bunch of new ones.
That's a good way to put it, a trade-off, for sure. And people are still arguing about the long-term consequences today. Some Alaska Natives, they felt like it was the only option, a way to get some control over their land and resources, in a system that wasn't really built to recognize their rights. But others, they saw it as a betrayal, a way for the government to grab Alaska's oil without really taking care of the people who'd called that land home for generations.
You mentioned oil, and it's interesting because some of the articles you sent, they point to big oil having a hand in ANCSA getting passed. Were the oil companies sort of pulling strings in the background?
Well, there's definitely stuff out there that suggests oil interests played a big role. At first, Alaska Native leaders actually had decent support from Alaska's representatives in Congress when it came to their land claims. But there is serious pushback from powerful figures in D.C., the ones who saw settling those claims as getting in the way of developing Alaskan oil.
Makes sense. Big oil probably didn't want anything messing with their profits.
Exactly. But as it became clearer just how much oil Alaska had, those same powerful figures, senators, congressmen, especially from the oil states, Texas, Oklahoma, they suddenly had a change of heart.
Why the sudden switch?
Well, I think they realized that if they settled the land claims issue, it would make things a lot smoother legally for getting that oil. They saw it as a way to unlock Alaskan oil, and in the end, it helped their own states' economies. Classic case of self-interest, lining up with or at least accommodating the needs of another group.
So Alaska Natives, they got caught in the middle of this tug of war between the government and the oil industry.
Yes, but it's super important to remember that they weren't just sitting back and letting it happen, They were fighting hard for their rights, pushing for a settlement that would actually benefit them.
So who are some of the big players in this fight?
One of the most influential was the Alaska Federation of Natives, the AFN. Formed in 1966, they brought together representatives from all these different regions and cultural groups across Alaska. They knew they had to present a united front if they wanted to stand a chance against the forces lined up against them.
Sounds like a real David and Goliath story.
It totally was, and it wasn't easy. One article you sent even mentioned that at one point the AFN only had $9 in their bank account. Some members were even mortgaging their homes to keep the movement going.
Wow. They were really putting it all on the line. So how did they pull it off?
Well, they were smart about it. They got loans from this small Alaska Native village and a tribal government in Washington that let them hire lawyers, lobbyists, all the folks they needed to represent them in D.C. Risky move, but it paid off. They got to sit at the table, made sure Alaska Natives' voices were heard when they were putting ANCSA together.
So ANCSA, it was at least partly a result of all that hard work by the AFN.
Absolutely. They were a huge part of shaping the legislation and making sure Alaska Natives got something for losing their claim to the land. But as we've been talking about, ANCSA, it wasn't perfect. Its legacy, it's still up for debate, even causing some arguments.
So while it was supposed to give them economic opportunities, some critics say the corporate structure it created, it actually went against traditional Native values and how they govern themselves. Let's dig into why those criticisms came up.
I think one of the biggest things was that the corporate model, it's all about profit, individual shareholders, that kind of thing. And that just didn't line up with how Alaska Natives traditionally thought about land and resources.
You're saying there's a fundamental difference in how those two systems work.
Oh, totally. In a lot of Alaska Native cultures, land is seen as like life-giving, a sacred space, something the whole community owns and takes care of together. So the idea of chopping it up and saying, okay, this piece is yours, this piece is mine, even if it's through shares in a corporation, it felt wrong. Disrespectful, even.
You mentioned earlier that some of those Alaska Native corporations, they've struggled financially. Is that because of this disconnect between the corporate structure and those traditional values?
It's definitely part of it, yeah. Some of the smaller corporations, especially those out in the villages, they've had a hard time adapting to how the corporate world works. All those legal and financial rules, it can be a lot to handle, costly too.
Sounds like they were kind of thrown in the deep end.
In some ways, yeah. And that lack of preparation, support, it definitely contributed to the problems some of those corporations have had.
You also mentioned that ANCSA had this thing called the 70% resource revenue sharing requirement. What was that all about, and why did it cause so much controversy?
Right. So the idea was to spread the wealth, make sure all the different Alaska Native corporations got a piece of the pie. So if a corporation made money from something on their land, like oil or timber, they had to share 70% of that with the other corporations.
Okay, but why was that a problem? Seems like a fair way to make sure everyone benefits.
Well, on paper, it sounded good, but it actually created some issues they didn't anticipate. Some Native groups felt like it took away even more control over their resources, like they were being forced to share what they had with corporations that maybe didn't share their values or their priorities.
Created division rather than unity.
In some cases, yeah. And it also raised questions about whether those corporations were really looking out for everyone in the community, like they might have under a more traditional system, or if they were just focused on making their shareholders happy.
It's like they tried to jam a square peg in a round hole, taking this Western capitalist model and forcing it onto a culture that had its own way of doing things.
That's a great way to put it. And it gets at this bigger question, the whole debate about tribal sovereignty. With ANCSA, one of the things that's never really been clear is if those Alaska Native corporations, if they actually count as Indian tribes under federal law.
Wait, so they're arguing about whether these corporations, the ones managing the land and resources, if they have the same power as traditional tribal governments.
Exactly. And that little difference, it makes a huge impact, especially when it comes to things like, are they eligible for federal programs and services that are meant for tribal communities?
So it's not just some, legal technicality. It has real consequences for Alaska Native people.
Absolutely. And this whole debate actually went to the Supreme Court just recently in a case about that CARES Act funding during COVID. The Treasury Department said, yeah, those corporations, they should get the money. But a bunch of federally recognized tribes from different states, including Alaska, they said, no way.
Wow. So even within the Alaska Native community, there's disagreement about how these corporations fit into the whole tribal sovereignty thing.
Yep. Another layer of complexity.
It almost sounds like ANCSA created more questions than it answered.
In some ways, yeah. It was groundbreaking, don't get me wrong, but it also left a lot of things unresolved.
We've spent a lot of time on the downsides. Were there any good things that came out of ANCSA?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Gotta acknowledge that it did bring some much-needed resources and infrastructure to Native communities. In some places, education, healthcare, housing. Lusky called Barrow, they were able to build this amazing utilidor system.
A utilidor? What's that?
It's like this network of pipes, 3 miles long, all underground, carries water, sewage, all the utility lines, protects them from the crazy Arctic weather.
Wow, so it's like a lifeline for the whole community.
Exactly. Utqiagvik's way up north, crazy weather all the time, so that utilidor is essential.
That's really something. I bet that made a huge difference for the people living there.
It did. And ANCSA helped with education, too. Like, in Utqiagvik, kids used to have to travel hundreds of miles to go to school. Now, they can go to Barrow High School, even go to college at Ilisagvik College, first tribally controlled college in Alaska.
So it's opening up opportunities for Alaskan Native students who might not have had those chances before.
Yep. And there's another interesting thing that came out of ANCSA, kind of indirectly. It actually helped bring back the Inupiaq language.
Really? How did that happen?
Well, before ANCSA, those government-run schools, they actually punished Native kids for speaking their language. But with ANCSA, those communities, they got more control, more resources, and they decided to make language and culture a priority.
So kind of a happy accident.
Exactly. And now you can learn Inupiaq in schools. Shows how determined those communities are to keep their culture alive.
Sounds like NCSA had a lot of effects, some intended, some not, creating opportunities, but also problems.
Yeah. It was a huge turning point for Alaska Natives, but it's a mixed bag. Big changes for sure, but whether those changes have really been good for them in a way that respects their traditions and values, well, that's still up for debate.
So how do we even measure if ANCSA was a success? Is it just about economic growth, how much money the corporations make? Or is it about something more, like preserving their culture, making sure their communities are healthy, and being able to pass their traditions on to future generations?
You hit the nail on the head. It all boils down to what success even means. Is it about numbers or something deeper, something like cultural vibrancy and the power to decide their own future?
That's a really good point. It's not just about the numbers, it's about real people and their lives.
Sure.
We can talk all day about the laws and the economics, but the real story is what it's been like for Alaska Natives to live through all this.
Couldn't agree more. If we really want to understand what ANCSA did, we need to listen to those who lived through it. Their families, their communities, they're the ones who were shaped by it.
It makes me think of that quote from Joe Yupik Sound, the guy who led the North Slope delegation. He was against ANCSA. He said the settlement caused hurt and fright and bitterness. He felt like other Native groups were trying to take more than their fair share. It really shows you how strong those emotions were, how ANCSA divided the Alaska Native community.
Yeah, powerful stuff. Reminds us that this wasn't just some abstract policy debate happening far away. It was real, it was personal, and it went to the core of people's identity, their connection to their ancestral lands, how they saw the future of their communities.
And it also highlights that within the Alaska Native community, there wasn't just one opinion on ANCSA. Some thought it was the best they could get. Others saw it as a betrayal. We have to acknowledge those different points of view.
Absolutely. And those different points of view, they make the whole thing even more interesting. History is never simple. It's full of contradictions, different ways of seeing things.
So even though ANCSA brought some benefits, it also created divisions, even resentment. Forced people to make tough decisions about how to hold on to their values while also living in a world that was changing so fast.
And those decisions, they've echoed down through the generations. They've impacted family relationships, how communities function, even how Alaska Native culture and identity are expressed and preserved.
That's so true. It makes you wonder about those younger generations of Alaska Natives, the ones who've grown up knowing nothing else. How do they see this legacy? How do they balance the opportunities it created with the challenges to their culture? It feels like we've just dipped our toes in the water here. There's so much more to uncover, especially those personal stories, from people who lived through all of this.
Oh, definitely. We've mainly been looking at the legal stuff, the economics of ANCSA, but to really get it, you got to hear from the people themselves, their experiences. Those are what make this history real.
Did any of the stuff you read give us a glimpse into those stories? Like, what was it actually like for Alaska Natives going through this massive change?
Yeah, actually, one of the sources talks about this woman, Yvonne Peter. She's Gwich'in Athabaskan, an activist, and the chief of the native village of Vashraiku. She says ANCSA caused a real split between the generations in her community.
A generational divide, what do you mean?
Well, she talks about how the elders, the ones who really understood their traditional ways, their connection to the land, they were suspicious of ANCSA. They saw it as a threat, to their way of life, their self-governance.
Makes sense. Hard to imagine giving up something that central to who you are.
Exactly. But she also says that her generation, the ones who grew up with ANCSA, they often saw it differently. For them, the corporations were a way to get ahead economically, to find their place in the modern world.
So it was this push and pull, wanting to preserve the old ways, but also needing to adapt to this new reality.
Yeah, that's it. And Avon Peters, she talks about how that played out in her own family.
Hmm.
Her dad, he was all for ANCSA, thought it was the best way to secure a future for his kids. But her mom, she wasn't so sure, worried it would mean losing their culture, their traditions.
That must have been tough, caught between those two sides.
It was, and a lot of Alaska Native families went through that, trying to figure out, okay, do we take the economic benefits and risk losing our culture?
So even inside families, there was this struggle to balance the past and the present, trying to hold on to tradition while moving into the modern world.
Exactly. And that struggle, it's still going on today. ANCSA's legacy is, well, complicated, good and bad wrapped up together. It gave them chances to improve their lives financially, but it came at a cost.
Like a bittersweet victory.
Yeah, I like that. It's a story of resilience, how they've adapted and how they're still fighting to define what it means to be Alaska Native in a world that's been changed by forces they couldn't control.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. We've gone through the history of ANCSA, the debates around it, and how it's still impacting those communities today.
And we've seen how it's about so much more than just land or money. It's about culture, identity, the human spirit, you know?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no easy fix when you're trying to balance the rights of Indigenous people with all the pressures of modern development.
Hmm.
But when we listen to the people who've been most affected, we start to understand those challenges better and the possibilities too.
And hopefully that understanding makes us approach these issues with more care, more respect, you know?
Well said. To all of you listening, we hope this deep dive gave you a better sense of ANCSA and its complicated story. We encourage you to keep digging into it and to seek out the voices of Alaska Native people. They're the ones who can really give us those insights into this journey that's still unfolding. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.